Welcome, everyone. Welcome.
Here we are. Let's see. So welcome everyone. This is part of the speaker series here at University of California, College of Law, San Francisco. Some of you may know previously by a different name, Hastings College of Law, and we're now also known as UC Law SF. And I'm Clark Freshman. I'm a professor of law here, and I want to say that this is one of the most special moments in my entire life to be able to introduce Len Riskin. So I've been teaching negotiation first at University of Miami full-time and then here in San Francisco full-time since 2007. And I've researched and written about mindfulness and emotion and bias, what I think of as external mindfulness or lie detection. And Len is someone who has affected so many people in the legal profession, amongst mediators and arbitrators, students, teachers such as myself, in so many different ways. And he was one of the people early on who brought negotiation into the Academy of Law Schools by negotiating successfully to, amongst other things, require that at University of Missouri, all the classes in the first year address alternative dispute resolution in some way. So that's the first part of his book, in a sense. It's about negotiation and bringing that into the legal curriculum. The second part, mindfulness, made a very big difference in my life and others. He organized a retreat, helped out by Charlie Halpern, which brought together lawyers and law professors, and a great meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, and became very important in my life. And more recently, has become very interested in the complementary skill of internal family systems, which he'll be talking about today as well. And so we're going to do this a little bit differently from the other speakers in our series, where it might be more along the lines of 20 minutes that someone speaks, then 40 minutes for discussion. Here, because this is such a complex area and such a great and complex book that Len will be talking about, in order to bring that all together, he'll be speaking probably for about twice as long, of a bit less time to talk about questions today. And so rather than cutting into your time for questions in the audience here and virtually around the world, Len, I'd like you just to feel free to begin and bring us up to date on your current work and worldview.
Thank you, Clark. And thank you so much for inviting me thanks to Clark and to Karen Grayson and the rest of the gang at the Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution. I'm happy to be here. Don't even know where to start, except I'll try to start in the beginning, which is this book, which I wrote, in some ways started when I was in law school, although I didn't know it. Because when I was in law school, I was in the first year, I was first in my class, but not in grades. It was first in my class in anxiety. There were no official records kept at that time. Now they probably do. Student services, some places probably do keep records of that nature. And gradually, I came to realize that I might have been a lot happier in law school had I not had so much anxiety about it. And somehow this has been on my mind all along over the last 50-ish years. But I'm talking about a problem of which only one aspect is anxiety. The problem I deal with in the book is this, that many of us in the world of negotiation and mediation and conflict resolution, even the most experienced and the best educated, let's say, still sometimes make significant mistakes and realize that after the fact, and realize that had they behaved differently, or had they behaved in the way they really knew they ought to behave deeply, they would have had a much better outcome. So in this book, I explain why this happens to people and what we can do about it. And I should say, as we get into it, the book mainly focuses explicitly on negotiations, but we're also talking about other kinds of situations that might give rise to conflict, but don't if we handle them well, and other kinds of difficult situations in which we could negotiate, even if not formally, but often we don't because we don't know enough. We don't realize what's going on. So let me tell you a story about me, 1992, when I was in Luxor, Egypt, with my wife and our 12-year-old son on a luxurious vacation. And after a stay in Cairo with a chauffeur-driven Mercedes, we found ourselves in Luxor at the end of our trip to Egypt, and we were staying in the best hotel in town. And on the last night, we decided for our final meal in Egypt, what else could there be but pizza? And so we went to the La Mama restaurant in the Sheraton Hotel, reputed to have the best pizza in Luxor. You've probably all heard of that pizza place. Actually, you probably all have heard about Luxor, which is the home of many of the most important pyramids in Egypt, and so is a great place for tourists. We were 1 mile away from this restaurant. The way to go there was on a broad boulevard running right next to the Nile called the Corniche. And as we started to walk, we noticed there were horse-drawn carriages, hundreds and hundreds of them, all looking for customers. My son, our son, Andrew, 12 years old, again, started campaigning to go in a carriage. I didn't want to, of course. I wanted to save money and I wanted to walk. Finally, my wife and I gave in, and I engaged in the conversation with a carriage driver who said it's 10 Egyptian pounds per person for this 1 hour ride. And for some reason that I can't remember, other than maybe that I was bargaining in a very adversarial way, I said, no, let's say 10 pounds for all three of us. What we're talking about is these 10 Egyptian pounds were at the time worth about $3 US. So in any event, in any realistic sense, this is not a significant kind of expenditure for us at that time. So finally, I think he agrees to take us all for 10 pounds. We jump in, we start driving, and Mr. Hassan, well, that's what I call him, I don't know his name, tells me about how hard he has to work to support his 6 children and his wife, and then says, by the way, it's 30 pounds for the 3 of you, 10 pounds each. I say, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I'm getting angry, and I declare that he should stop. I said, stop the carriage. We're getting out right now. And he, of course, completely ignores me and keeps driving. And we continue arguing a little, but I'm mainly steaming. So we get to this restaurant outside, we drive up to the front of the hotel. Andrew and Casey, my wife, and I jump out. I tell Mr. Hassan and I have a little argument again about how much I owe him. And I say, I'm going to give you 10. I feel so, while I'm telling you this story, I feel like so small and stingy. But I didn't then. I felt like I was wronged by this guy who was not behaving right. So I said, I'm going to give you 10 pounds. And I open my wallet and I see I don't have a 10-pound note. The smallest thing I have is a 20-pound note. I tell him that and I say, will you give me change? And I think he says yes. So I give him the 20-pound note and he does something with it. And he says, that's not a 20-pound note. It's a 50 piastre note or something like that. And they look similar, he says, but this one's worth only pennies. And he shows it to me and he's right. They look almost the same. Now, what am I going to do? So my wife says, as she'd been saying before, pay the guy, give him the 20, give him the 40, give him whatever he wants. He needs the money. This guy, he needs it a lot more than we do. So I wound up she gave me another 20. I gave them to him. So then gave it to him. So now I had paid 40 pounds and he had only asked for 30 in the first place. I'm confused. I'm embarrassed. And then he asks me for a tip. Bakshish, he says. That means tip. And guess what happened? I gave him a tip. After all of that, I gave this guy a tip, and it was because by then I was frightened. Didn't know what was going to happen. I was not familiar with the turf. I saw that he was much more clever than I. So I gave him the tip. We slouched into the restaurant, and none of us remember the dinner at all. The food, I should say. I ruined the dinner talking about Mr. Hassan. Casey says, I don't understand men. A woman would never do this. I tried to explain. After dinner, I insist that we find Mr. Hassan. I want to talk to him and put our relationship back into balance. At that time, a lot of our colleagues in the dispute resolution field were talking about that concept. We walk and walk and walk. Finally, we see Mr. Hassan driving his carriage along the other side of the corniche. He sees me. We stop. He stops. He and I stare at each other, looking real as tough as we can, which in his case was pretty tough. I was probably not very credible, but I was then in the position of the proverbial dog who's chasing a car, barking. When the dog catches the car, what are the dog's options? Not much. And I was in that same position with Mr. Hassan. And so after staring at him for a while, and him staring back, I slouched once more and we all walked back to the Hyatt Hotel. And that was the end of it, except I've been writing about this and thinking about it now for more than 25 years. It made quite an impression on me. The outcome, it was a terrible outcome for us, my family and me. We had a lousy evening after a wonderful trip. Mr. Hassan came out fairly well in terms of money, I think, and he may have enjoyed the evening, maybe not. I have no idea. But why did I come out so poorly when I was at the time, I was about 50 years old. I had been teaching and writing about negotiation and mediation for a while. I had traveled a lot around the world, and I thought I was pretty capable at negotiation. I might even have called myself an expert. And other people thought I was an expert. So what did I do wrong? The main thing I did wrong, that I didn't have to do wrong, that I knew I should have done in a different way, was I completely ignored the interests of my side of the dispute. The principal interest of Casey and Andrew was to have a pleasant evening. It's not clear to me what my principal interest was, but I focused instead of my position, which I just made up. I had no particular basis for saying 10 pounds for the whole group. I knew nothing about prices in that area, and I'm sure they were not public anyway. But so what happened? Why is it that I didn't use interest when by then I had been writing about the importance or potential value of interest for years and teaching and pontificating about interests, and I didn't use them. So why didn't I? Why didn't I? There are lots of reasons, but I've categorized, or I've come up with 5 obstacles that I think frequently get in the way of people in the category I'm discussing. People who know how to negotiate, have experience, and screw up, and later realize that they really screwed up. They did not make good decisions, the kind of decisions they should have been able to make because of their experience and background. So, and let me just do a slight detour and say this same system or the same set of obstacles I'm going to suggest to you play a role in many situations, not just negotiation, many situations in which we are doing something that we really know how to do and have done many times, and we goof it up. When that happens, and that happens to all of us sometimes, I have developed the idea that there are 5 very common reasons. One is we behave automatically out of our habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's what I was doing, because at that time, although I taught about interests in real life, I was raised in a culture in which there was a lot of adversarial bargaining about anything that was a significant amount of money. So I followed those automatic ways of thinking, feeling, behaving. I was excessively self-centered. I didn't think about the interests of Mr. Hassan and his family. I also didn't really think about Casey's interests and Andrew's interests in having a good time and not being embarrassed by my behavior. I didn't manage my emotions well, so it's management of emotions. I didn't display very good social skills, and I didn't manage my focus or awareness. I wasn't really paying attention to the dynamic between Mr. Hassan and me. So I'm calling these 5 obstacles. 1, automatic habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Excessively self-centered perspectives, inadequate management of emotions, insufficient social skills, and inadequate management of awareness. Not guilty. These were obstacles that arose within me and stopped me from performing well. At least this is my argument. So I'd like, before I go on, I'd like to ask your indulgence. I'm going to explain what happened, and don't expect precision, because this event happened in 1992. So it's possible I do not have perfect recollection. It's certainly more than possible that I'm not objective, but I'll do the best I can. So let's say, if we take it for granted that we run into these kinds of obstacles, and when we do, they sometimes interfere with our ability to do something well, something that we know how to do well already. And then in the book, I propose 2 methods of dealing with these kinds of problems, or in my words, transcending these obstacles. One is mindfulness. The other is internal family systems. So probably in this audience, most people know something about mindfulness. But I'll say just a few words about it because internal family systems is much newer and probably will be more interesting for that reason to more people. So mindfulness is a particular way of paying attention. This is mindfulness, the way I use the term. There are other meanings. Paying attention to your present moment experience, moment by moment, without judgment, and with some measure of peace. It's we develop mindfulness typically through meditation. As you probably know, it's very, very popular in much of the world, particularly in the United States, many Western countries, and many Latin American countries. And it really developed initially about 2,500 years ago in what is now India. So, as I've written in the book and elsewhere about how mindfulness can help us transcend these obstacles, so I'm not by undoing each one of them. So I'm not going to go into that again because I want to explain how what internal family systems is and how it can help in the same way, help us transcend obstacles to skillfully negotiating. So internal family systems is a model of the mind. It was developed in about 1972 by Richard Schwartz, who was a family therapist and still is. And it's really the fastest growing approach to psychotherapy over the past few decades. It's also used in other fields, not just psychotherapy. So some mediators use it, negotiators can use it. Some medical decision-making is based on or involved with internal family systems. In our world of conflict resolution, in particular, the most important writing on internal family systems in connection with mediation was written by David Hoffman, who happens to be on this call right now, and he's waving, has written wonderful articles and done wonderful training programs on how to use internal family systems in mediation. So let me explain it a little bit and ask you, before I start, to try your best to suspend disbelief. And if you feel cynical or very skeptical about this, try to treat those beliefs mindfully and just notice them and let them be, but don't let them stop you from listening. And as you're listening, consider slowly whether what I'm talking about might be helpful to you and might it really work. So, okay, so there's this IFS is this model of the mind, and there are two kinds of entities within the model of the mind. One kind of entity is called a part, and the other is called the self. Parts, we have many parts and one self. The parts are, as psychologist John Rowan defined them, parts are semi-autonomous regions of the personality capable of acting as a person. I'll say that again, semi-autonomous regions of the personality capable of acting as a person. So parts are like little people within us. They have many of the qualities and characteristics of people. They have an age. They were formed because they were formed at a certain time in our life. They have certain beliefs and goals. They experience emotions. They have heuristics, ways of understanding things and thinking. Sometimes we see them in an image form and sometimes not. Now, this conception is not new with internal family systems. In fact, there's been a conception very similar that was used a good deal in mediation training in the 1980s by Jack Himmelstein and Gary Friedman. Some people in the audience certainly know them or their work. But that was called psychosynthesis. It has the same basic structure or idea of the structure of the mind or the psyche. The explanations of how to work with it are not nearly as clear as they are in internal family systems. Okay, so we have parts that they're all trying to help us in some way. So we have a part, most of us will have a part that's generous and a part that's stingy, a part that's brave and a part that's frightened, a part that thinks they're very capable and part that thinks they're not very capable, and so forth. They usually travel in pairs of opposites, and they are all trying to help the person. The problem is they're partial. They're partial in the sense that they're trying to help the person, so they favor the person, their own person. They're also partial in that they don't know much about the person and the person's life. So it's often that our parts think we're much younger than we are. Sometimes they'll think if we're an adult, even so, they'll think we're 9 years old or some much earlier age and have the capacities and abilities of a person of that age. In most parts, perceive that they have a certain assignment or role that they're supposed to play. So some parts, for example, were called managers. They're concerned about, among other things, protecting your image, certain images, your identity as a lawyer, for example, as a reliable citizen, as a member of such and such a group, as a kind person, as a dangerous person, whatever image you want to convey to the outside world. One or more of your parts are designed to and feel they have the responsibility to keep those images alive or keep other capacities of yours alive. Make sure that you continue to live in such a way that, for example, so you can continue to get jobs and make money, or you can continue to have friends and have a place to live other than your car, and so forth. So this is all, and the parts can talk to one another, they can communicate, they can argue, they can negotiate, and most of them, or many of them, when they wish, can take over management of you in your life on Earth. So sometimes parts will move into our consciousness, control how we perceive things, and direct our behavior. So that's parts. The other component of the system is called the self. So language can get very confusing because we frequently say yourself, myself, and so forth. But usually when we're talking about people and other people, particularly in the world of negotiation and law, we're thinking about an individual human being or groups of individual human beings. In the IFS terminology, though, the self is something else. The self is not one of the parts. It's of a completely different nature. It's something like what's called the soul in some religions and spiritual traditions. It's the real you in this way of thinking. That's the real you. So the real you is not a lawyer or whatever it is you do for a living, or a member of such and such a religion, and so forth, and so forth. But the self is, the purpose of internal family systems is self-leadership. So the self should be running the show in the same way that the conductor of an orchestra is running the performances. And the difference between the self and the conductor or director of an orchestra is that the self is all wise, full of compassion, full of clarity. In a way, it's perfect. And the conductor of an orchestra is never quite perfect, nor are any other human beings. The self, myself, at least in theory and in reality, I think it doesn't favor me over you, and yourself doesn't favor you over me. And the self has the capacity to manage all the parts and to run the show. However, in real life, it doesn't often have an opportunity to do that. But one of the purposes of IFS is to develop that self-leadership. So the idea is that there's something like our consciousness where decisions are made, and if the self is in control of consciousness, then we'll make all correct decisions, do the right thing all along. But in reality, most of the time, there are also parts in there. And when parts and the self are in consciousness, as some colleagues have said, the parts are running the bus. So that's the big picture. Okay, self, one self, many parts. The parts have different labels. Some are managers, some are they're in my own way of thinking about this. The easiest organizational structure in human life that describes this is the organizational charts that have been used for many, many years to describe the functions of an organization. This one is based, internal family systems is based on a form of psychotherapy for an individual. And the idea is that it's called internal family systems therapy. It's dealing with real family. So if a psychotherapist has a client with problems and they're doing psychotherapy, they want to know what's going on in this person's family, because the thinking is that it's a system, this person is part of a system, and you have to know what else is going on in the system and what this person's obligations and fears and problems are. So Richard Schwartz took that model and applied it to the human psyche. Okay. So I want to go back just quickly to the scene in Luxor, Egypt, and try to explain what happened in terms of internal family systems. So I'm talking about my interactions with Mr. Hassan primarily. There were 4 parts of mine that were active. One, and I give them all names, you can name your parts. One of my parts is Gandhi, who has the characteristics of Mohandas Gandhi. So he's almost like the self. Mr. Stingy, who's trying to save money. Big Shot, who thinks I'm very important and I deserve a great deal of deference. Then there's a good dad who wants to teach my son to survive in the world by teaching him negotiation. So what happens so I'm going to just say what happened while I was engaged with Mr. Hassan, sitting on this carriage, and he says to me, by the way, it's 30 pounds. And here's what happens. here's what I hear in my mind, the voice of Gandhi. Just give this poor guy the money. He's poor. He's got a family. He needs the money more than you do. Gandhi is interrupted at that point by Big Shot, who says, shut up. All right, shut up. And that's the last I heard of Gandhi. So Gandhi disappeared. In the theory, in the IFS theory, he becomes an exile. So he's no longer in the active power structure. And then Mr. Stingy joins up, and Mr. Stingy says, don't give him any more than 10 pounds. You're not made of money. You've spent too much money on this trip. You didn't even need, why did you got that expensive car and driver in Cairo? Don't give him any more. You can't afford it. You just can't afford it. Then Mr. Big Shot comes back in and he says, this guy doesn't know who you are. You're very important. You're an expert on negotiation. You're sophisticated. You're a man of the world. He shouldn't treat you this way. Good dad starts telling me I need to train Andrew I need to show Andrew that I know how to negotiate. So then what happens in my reconstruction of this event is that some of these parts form a coalition. Mr. Stingy, Big Shot, and Good Dad, they take over. They do it in the form of what I call the coalition of the small-minded. They carry out a coup d'etat. They put the self under house arrest in the corner of consciousness, and they take over consciousness and determine how I see things and how I behave. Now, this may seem very crazy and far-fetched, but something like this, I imagine, happened. And Richard Schwartz, who invented IFS, thinks this is pretty good. So my insight, my big insight about this, just to cut to the chase because we've got some other stuff to do. My interests and positions were those of, they weren't really mine. They weren't really mine. The interests and positions that I was using were not mine. They were those of the coalition of the small-minded, of the parts that were part of that coalition. Same with some other concerns about my emotional needs and so forth. And it's explained a lot in the book. So it wasn't, in a sense, it wasn't I that was behaving, is doing this stuff. It was my parts through me. So with this kind of understanding, there are many ways in which IFS can help a negotiator or a mediator or any person get over these obstacles. And I've talked a lot about them in the book. They can help, those of us who are teachers can help, they can help in many ways, which maybe we'll get into later. They can also be used in courses and so forth. So that's the quick and maybe not quick enough for some of you, but the quick and dirty overview of this book, which I've been working on for a very long time. And I should say that I had been working on a previous book about mindfulness and conflict, and it was just about done when I fortunately or unfortunately ran into David Hoffman at a conference on the negotiation within at Harvard Law School, where we were both speaking. And I talked about psychosynthesis, which I mentioned before. David introduced internal family systems. After that, we went out for coffee and he told me I have to get into this. And so I did. And so it took me an extra 10 or 11 years to finish the book. Thanks a lot, David. So I'm going to stop and maybe Clark will have some questions or comments, and maybe some of you will have some questions or comments. Thanks for your kind attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Len. That was really a terrific introduction. And I did not know that part about David Hoffman enriching this and this 10-year detour. So I think what I'd like to start off with, that I know many people have wondered about, is to what extent internal family systems helps people out, even if they have a different view of negotiation than you set forth in the first part of the book. So the first part of the book, there's interests versus positions. And at least in Richard Schwartz's version of the self is impartial. So it's going to favor what's maybe the best solution all around and fairest. But then you also mentioned along the way that both of these aspects, both mindfulness and internal family systems, can help people in a sense with their performance, where they know what they want to do, which might or might not be being impartial in the sense of internal family systems notion of self, and maybe not in terms of let's do something that's creative and benefits everyone. So to what extent can internal family systems and mindfulness help out even the person who is the competitive negotiator? So the person who might be an attorney and who views themselves as having to advocate for their client, even at the expense of others, and perhaps of the parent who wants to favor their children over others, or the friend who wants to favor their friend or others.
So it's a wonderful question. The answer is yes. IFS can be helpful to such people, even if they want to and do stick with their particular goals, which may be very much along the lines of getting as much as I can. I want to separate, because it's too complicated, the situation of a lawyer negotiating as a representative of a client, because none of us have time to discuss it. It's harder. And so I don't think it's quite right here to try to take it on in these few minutes. You can use, as I said, that one of the goals of IFS is to have the self lead. In reality, that doesn't happen all that often. One. Two, you can use IFS and forget all about the self if you want to. There's a lot, the idea of parts is enough, I think, to help people or enable people to better negotiate, even if they're only negotiating over, say, an amount of money or amount of something, and want to get as much as they can get. The reason it can be helpful is it's a tool for understanding yourself and for understanding other people. And the more you can understand or be aware of what your parts are doing, the better chance you have of managing your parts so they can be more effective toward the goals you're trying to achieve. And the more you understand that the other party with whom you're negotiating or dealing also has parts, and as you get more into this, it becomes easier to become aware not of exactly the part that is controlling the other person's behavior, but of the kind of part or parts that are probably controlling the other person's behavior. So to take a simple example, which we run into constantly in negotiations involving lawyers or other people who are doing formal negotiations, has to do with the individual identity concerns that the people have, like core concerns, like wanting to be appreciated, wanting to have autonomy, and so forth. If we can become aware, for example, and I'm sure we've all run into this, those of us who've mediated or negotiated with lawyers, if we can tell that the party on the other side as a part that's speaking for them, and the part needs acknowledgement of how important they are or how powerful they are as lawyers or something like that, or how skillful, brilliant they are. It would make it simple for you to realize, oh, I better take care of that instead of beating them down, for example.
So in Luxor example, if the person who was the driver had recognized Big Shot, and what he was trying to do was get money for his family, let's just assume that's correct, or for himself, then instead of ignoring the Big Shot in you, he might have approached Big Shot by saying, instead of asking for the tip in the way that he did, or saying this in the way that he did, he might instead say, can I ask you for some advice? People tell me you're one of the greatest negotiators, and here's a common problem I run into. Can you help me? And that might have accommodated Big Shot, and then Big Shot might have felt more generous. Is that an example?
I think it is. And that probably would have worked, of course, with me. But I would have liked him a lot. Just, of course, he wouldn't know that. All he knew about me was that I was an American, and he must have thought I was rich, and I was rich compared to him. And he did compliment me on my family, but I didn't care. I knew he was trying to manipulate me then. So, but that's a great example. In fact, in my life as a mediator, I see that a lot. And it's just in my life being a law school professor for a long time. I'm just thinking of a donor to a law school where I previously taught. And I went to dinner with him and 4 other faculty members, and he spent the first 45 minutes bragging about himself. Mm-hmm. And we all just listened until finally he was finished and felt okay. He had, and we knew enough to listen to him. Also, he was a big donor to the law school. But yeah, I think that's a really good example. And go ahead.
Oh, no. Go ahead. I was going to switch to how you might use this as a negotiation teacher as the question, but you were going to say something, so let me let you finish that.
I think I forgot. No, I know what I was going to say. Something about when you have some experience with internal family systems, you can deal with your own parts much the way if you were a good leader and were the head of some sort of an organization or group, and much the same way that you might work with your employees or staff, and trying to help them because they usually, every place I've worked, and I've probably worked, I think, my entire adult life in large organizations, there have always been employees in these organizations, not many, but a few people whom the others didn't want to invite to certain kinds of gatherings. Say, for example, this is a meeting with a congressional committee or a meeting with potential buyers of whatever we were selling. There's certain people you wouldn't want to bring along because you think they would really ruin the conversations, and for one reason or another, because of their own personalities and beliefs and so forth. But you could talk to them and counsel them and ask them, explain why not explain why you can't invite them, but explain that you'll be able to take care of it. Sometimes these people cause trouble in the office because they think others are not able to do some things that need to be done and that they can do it. So the idea would be to maybe counsel these parts the way you would counsel if you were a good leader, some of your employees, and say, don't worry, we can take care of it. I appreciate your concern. We'll tell you all about this after the meeting and it'll be fine. Something like that. And you can also mediate with parts. But let's go on to your next one. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great this may be another way of illustrating that. And then I'll ask this question briefly. And I know that Scott Rogers, my good friend, colleague at University of Miami, asked to ask a question. So this has to do with how you might, and I'll have to ask my students here in the room to cover their ears perhaps, but there's another version of it. How would you advise a negotiation teacher to work with parts? And how might you advise, negotiation students or law students in generally to work with parts so that they're able to deal with their faculty members, for example, in a better way? Well, either or both of those.
Well, there's a lot there. I find the internal family systems, for me, tremendously helpful in understanding more about myself. And because I always have a part that's telling me it's very important that everybody likes me. Everyone has to like me. And if I think somebody doesn't like me, this voice is saying, you must have screwed something up. Why didn't you do this or that? Something like this. If I can become aware of that, I can let it go. But when I think about the context of law students and law teachers, it takes me right back to my first year in law school, when it seemed to me that most of our professors were really putting on an act about how important they were. And I was very aware of it, but I was also frightened of them and admired them. But what I didn't realize is that with some of them, this kind of behavior was probably coming from a very insecure part, or a part that thought they had to demonstrate that they were really capable lawyers, that they were well connected in the world and things like that. And so I felt I don't know what the word is, something negative about those who made a big show of how important they were without thinking that there could be all kinds of reasons. Now I think there are parts that did that, but any of us who teach in law schools have certain insecurities and deal with them in various ways. And sometimes it'd be nice if students would understand and forgive us. I hope there are no students on this call.
Oh, we've got 8 in the room.
No, there are. I had a great hour with Clark students earlier. Anyway.
And on the flip side of that, so you might have thought as a student about the Mr. Big Shots maybe that were in your professors. As professors, it might be, or instructors, as you teach often to other organizations or staff at Northwestern, it might be possible to have sympathy for people who might be in some ways difficult from your perspective as the instructor, by thinking about which part might be active there, and empathizing with that part would be one aspect of internal family systems.
Yeah.
And another one would be addressing that part's needs.
Right.
Somewhat.
Yeah. That's perfect. I mean, it's in our roles as professors, or in our jobs as professors, we've run into different versions of the same kinds of issues that everybody runs into in their work. So having more understanding of how people function, having this idea of thoughts, of parts, our own and others, makes it easier, I think, to understand other people in a more compassionate way, rather than thinking this is bad, this student's not respecting me in class, the student's watching a movie on his iPad while I'm giving this really important lecture. So things like that, yeah. And then a lot of our colleagues are starting to use the book in various kinds of negotiation or ADR courses. But I don't think we have time to go into that. Did you say Scott Rogers has a question?
Yes, Scott does. And I'm going to ask my colleague Karen if she knows how to put Scott up on the screen, which I'm not sure that
He's on my, can he?
I can spotlight him. Scott. Rogers, you said?
Yes, Scott Rogers, yes.
Oh.
So let's see if we can put him up there. There we are, Scott, and he's unmuted.
All righty. Thank you, Clark. And thank you, Len, for another remarkable contribution. I'd like to just touch a little bit on the relationship of the self to the parts. And in particular, when you were describing, you talked about how the various parts sort of have their complementary polarity to some extent, right? Each one has sort of like a, the not so effective or functional or whatever we want to say, they have they do serve roles that are important. So when you spoke about Gandhi, you sort of said sort of like self. You sort of like, sort of like self. And so so the question specifically is, when Big Shot is soothed, or whatever the framing is, and Gandhi sort of emerges to sort of play it out in a more effective way, well, is just a better part, not just, is it a more skillful part that has more room to surface and then be more skillful? Or is the self having more room to have that more fundamental aspect emerge because the parts are less encumbering its expression?
Well, let me just back up and say, when I said that Gandhi is something like the self, I also what I meant to say, he seems like a self, but Gandhi was a human being, and so Gandhi made mistakes and had biases and so forth. But I'm not clear on the second part of your question.
Is it a better part that emerges, or is it the self that has more room to express a more wise and compassionate way of responding?
Oh, you mean what really happens? Oh, I see what you mean. So it might be if Gandhi, and maybe David will have some comments about this, if Gandhi had more power or more allies, Gandhi might have been able, with his allies, to take over consciousness and push out the more aggressive parts, just as might happen in a real life organization, right? The vice president of this can take on more authority and power and push out the vice president of something else. Does that answer your question?
It suggests that another part, a more skillful part, is giving room to play things out. I'm just curious also if there's the parts aren't like they're not calling the shots, even if they're good and useful, that there's this larger capacity we have of just being present for our experience, to move into the mindfulness piece, and in a more effortless, less trying way, we're effective. And the parts are not trying to, whether for good or not, sort of manipulate things.
And, and the mindfulness angle there, to which I think you're referring, is the idea that if we're mindful and are tuned into our own parts, when one part went, for example, in the case I described, when Mr. Stingy says, "Shut up," to Gandhi, Gandhi might have been able to handle it in a skillful way if the Gandhi part were sufficiently skillful and adept and so forth. So I'm making believe this is like that each part is like a person in an organization that has other employees and other managers. And we know that sort of thing happens. There's a great research study about large corporations when they are in very public conflicts with others, including members of the public. There's often a concern about which manager is in charge of handling it. Would it be either the general counsel, the legal counsel, or the public relations person? And it varies from company to company, and it varies with the characteristics of the people who occupy these two positions. so I do think it's something like that. And okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you.
Give me a signal. I think
That was an attempt to signal. I feel like we could stay on here for an enormous amount of time afterwards. And I'm looking around the room and being mindful of the parts of my students who probably would like to stay here and the parts of them that may have to go to the bathroom and go on to other classes. And soon to be the parts of my colleagues who may be knocking at the door to come on. So I think we'll take a break here to allow at least my students to leave. Thank you all very much who want to. And Len, if you have time to stay on a few more minutes, maybe we could wrap up. And if David wants to say something, especially, maybe he could chime in. It sounds like to me, the last part, Scott's question was so great about, is this about the self having room, and the self is impartial, and the self is perhaps present and thinks of the best solution, and is, if I'm understanding correctly, both impartial but also efficient, right? So the self comes up with the best ideas, in a sense, overcomes the obstacles that you've outlined in the book. So it could be that that's what happens, or it could be that there's a different coalition. That's what I think what Scott was maybe getting at, is it could be, instead of the coalition of the small-minded, maybe there's a coalition of the larger-minded, or it's this other part that takes over. Meaning that, so it's the self.
And the self could help the parts negotiate by asserting, just as could, in theory, the chairman of the board, chair of the board of a large corporation, or something like that. But I'm guessing David would be able to add something on
Sure.
David, Karen, can we put David into the conversation? That would be, yep, there he is. David Hoffman. Hi, David.
Hi, Clark. Good to see you, Len. Always great to see you. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'd be happy to respond to the question that's on the floor. And there are just two other points I'd like to add, if I might. So with regard to the Gandhi part, in the IFS model, they sometimes refer to self-like parts that we think are self-energy, but they really have an agenda. Like, I want to be perceived as very chill. I'd like to be like Gandhi. That's my agenda. And that's not self-energy. Self-energy notices that we have a part, probably a commendable part, that wants our system to be more Gandhi-like. But our self is aware that sometimes these very militant parts, like, Mr. Stingy and Mr. Big Shot and so forth, jump in. So what it take to be self-led means I think this is where mindfulness really fits in with IFS beautifully, because it teaches us to take a breath, and maybe let the amygdala-driven parts, just chill for a moment, so the prefrontal cortex can kick in, and then self-energy can negotiate the deal among these parts and hear what the agendas are, and really think through, well, what if we let Mr. Stingy and Mr. Big Shot run this negotiation? What could go wrong? Well, a lot could go wrong, like what you described, Len. So it was such a lovely description of all the sort of psychological wreckage that followed from not having a psychological tool like the IFS model to bring self, unblend, let the parts unblend, bring self-energy to the fore, and manage your internal negotiation. So such a great story. I also, there's an analogy here. When I mediate cases where there are like lots of people in one of the conference rooms and a lot of people in the other conference room, a company that might have 6 or 7 or 8 people representing it, what I find is that the negotiation among those people, in that negotiation, the most militant voices often hold sway, and they shame the peacemaking voices in that room. It's a complicated problem for us in the mediation field. And same thing, I think, happens in our internal systems. It takes a lot to overcome the fearful protector energy, saying, we're not going to be suckered again. Imagine how bad we're going to feel if someone takes advantage of us, The second point I wanted to make is that you mentioned teaching. And Audrey Lee and I have been co-teaching a course called Diversity and Dispute Resolution at Harvard Law School for several years now. And we devote, it's 11 consecutive days in the January term. And we devote a whole day to the internal family systems model. And the students love it. They absolutely love it. We get such positive feedback because it's a useful life tool, not just a useful, negotiating tool. And the last point I wanted to make is from a training that I did, a workshop that I did earlier today for a group of very experienced mediators. I asked, out of these 24 mediators, how many of you have ever heard of the internal family systems before? And maybe 3 hands went up. How many of you have ever had any training in it? 1 hand went up. How many of you have ever used it in a mediation? And 1 hand went up. So I said to that person, would you please describe your experience using it? And she said, happily. And she told this great story. I'll try to boil it down to a bite size. She said, I went to an IFS training, and the next day I had a mediation with one of the most difficult people I've ever worked with in a mediation. I've worked with him before. His reputation precedes him. And I said, I'm hearing that there's a part of you that really wants to just show the other side how wrong they are. Yes, absolutely. And another part of you that is, looking out for your client, trying to get the most. Yes. Another part of you that's concerned that your client's going to be very unhappy if this goes to trial and maybe doesn't like the result. Yes, all those parts. And all of a sudden, this guy sort of relaxed, and he said, this mediator said, I got all this from a training I just went to. And he says, well, it's fabulous stuff because I feel like you really heard me. And, we in the mediation field say, until people feel heard, they won't listen. More accurately, we would say, until the parts feel heard, the system won't listen.
David, that's so great. That's such a great and practical example that I think a lot of us can relate to. And maybe that's even something in working with students as well as negotiation teachers that that there might be times like that. That's really terrific. I think out of respect for our audience members who otherwise might want to move on, and the classroom that I might have to vacate shortly, we may need to close for now. But Len, thank you so much. And David, thank you so much for contributing to that. And thank you, Scott, for raising, that excellent question. And I know that some of us will be meeting with Len shortly to sort of think more about how to make this even more available to others, so that the next time, David, you're in one of these trainings, instead of it just being one person, it might be everyone in the room has a story to share there. So, Len, thank you very, very much for joining us. This was terrific. This is one of the highlights of my life, and also of my career as a law school teacher, to really learn about this. It's been absolutely terrific.
There's a part of me that believes what you just said. Other parts that are a little skeptical, but thank you so much. And thanks to David and Scott and Karen and all of you for showing up. This was great fun for me. I've learned a lot. So.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you gave a shout out to Karen Grayson, who is our very able director of education, and also does a lot of our administrative work, who made all of this happen, and to Maddie as well, who's our deputy director, who helped out with a lot of the publicity and the conceptualizing of this, and especially to Hiro Aragaki, our new director, who conceived of this course, which is based on our final thank you to Russell Korobkin at UCLA, who came up with a course very similar to this that inspired our speaker series as well. So thank you all very much. And the next, for those of you who are listening, the next speaker in our series will be Michael Moffat next week, talking about bespoke ADR ethics. So how ADR ethics might have formed when there was a simpler time of negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. And now when we have hybrid processes and specialized processes, there might be a need for a different kind of ethics, which she's just beginning to work on for a sabbatical project for next year. So I look forward to seeing some of you next week and for the rest of our speaker series. So on behalf of UC Law SF and its Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution, thank you very much, Len, and thank you to everyone here who's able to attend and who watches this later. Take care, Len.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Clark. Thanks, Len. Really great.
Bye. Take